Hey guys, welcome to the third episode of my guide to the basics of Python. Last episode, we went over what variables are, the basic math operators, some user input, and some basic error handling. Today, we're going to learn about what Boolean data types are, loops, logical operators, and some logical keywords. So let's get into it. First, let's learn about Boolean variables. When you're writing code, a lot of times you're going to need to know when something is true or false. That's when you use Booleans. The only two values for Booleans can be are true or false. These two values come in handy whenever you start to use logic in Python, so that's to say that they're used quite a lot. Now that we're at least a bit familiar with Booleans, let's go over some of their operators. The basic operators for Booleans are and, or, and not. The and operator will evaluate to true if all Boolean values are also true, otherwise it will evaluate to false. The OR operator will evaluate to true if at least one of the Boolean values are true, otherwise it will be false, since there are no true values. And the NOT operator will evaluate to the opposite of the given Boolean value. So not true would be false and not false would be true. Before we get into conditional statements, let's quickly talk about logical operators. Logical operators in Python mean the same thing as they do in math. Greater than, equal to, less than, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, and not equal to. Now that we know some of the basics of decision making, let's learn about conditional statements. We'll use if and else statements if we want to run blocks of code only under specific conditions. If those conditions are met, then the block of code under the if statement will run, and if they aren't met, then the code is skipped and the code under the else statement will run. You don't need to have an else statement after every if statement. If there isn't one, then the code underneath the if statement is skipped, and the code underneath the if statement is run. So everything that's not in the namespace, and we'll go over namespace in a later episode. There is also another keyword that we can use in conditional statements, the elif keyword. We can use this keyword to check for multiple conditions. For example, if the condition in the if block is not met, then the elif block is checked. Imagine, for some reason, you want to print the same sentence, hello, my name is blank, how are you today, 50 times. It's going to take a long time to write each of those lines by hand. That's where loops come into play. Given that a condition is met, they do an action over and over again until some conditions are met that stop it, although in some cases this may not be the case. There are two types of loops in Python, for and while loops. While loops will continue to run the code inside of them until the condition that was required to run them is no longer true. So for example, if I create the variable x and assign it to the value of 0 and then create a while loop that will continue to print hello and add 1s to the x value as long as x is less than 10. Once x equals 10, the code in the while block will no longer run, and the code underneath the loop will run, which in this case is nothing. The next type of loop, the for loop, is used for iterating over a sequence, which at the moment does not matter much to us, but it will soon. One example for a use of the for loop is creating a for loop that will print the phrase hello world for every number from 1 up to but not including 10 by using the range function. Here, I is called the iteration variable, which is a type of variable that can only be used within the scope of a function. We'll come back to scope. We'll come back to these ideas in a later video. And that brings us to the end of the episode. To recap what we learned about was Boolean data types, their operators, and we also learned about decision making in Python. Next episode, we will introduce you to the list data structure. That's all I have for now. Goodbye.